Alrighty, we are live. What is going on, everybody? So it's Sam over at the Foot Whisperer Reflexology Institute, and we are here today to do some amazing talking about a somewhat controversial topic in the subject of reflexology, which is hands-on, as opposed to some of the other webinars we've done, which have been more assessment-based, but you'll find that I weave in that assessment-based content in this webinar anyway. Oh, hey Bev, jumping on. Perfect. Everybody's jumping on in the chat. I absolutely love it. Apparently everybody had their timers set for 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So welcome everybody. Make sure that you're posting in the chat where you are from, where you're tuning in for. And for those of you watching the replay, also let me know in the comments below where you're tuning in from. I absolutely love to know kind of where my people are at. Sandy's on. Excellent. Wonderful. And make sure to use the chat throughout the presentation because I will be looking at it. Oh, everybody's having a little chat over there in the chat. I absolutely love it. So today we're going to talk about point work, but I just wanted to preface this talk because I have a lot to say about this topic. I also have a lot of opinions based on personal experience and a lot of clinical cases to share with you. So although the PowerPoint presentation will not be as long slide-wise, there will be a lot of very deep tangenty stuff that I will be talking about that hopefully you will find value. If you don't find it valuable, then just throw a virtual shoe in my direction and I will know to rearrange the discussion points. Oh, hello everybody. Hey, Amy, thanks for jumping on. So that is just my warning label for this webinar is there are a lot of very strong feelings present in this webinar, and so I will be backing them all up with clinical experience to let you know how I personally address point work within my practice. I personally think that it's a topic that is more so argued about and less so intelligently debated, so hopefully my experience will add to the value of the conversation on the internet as opposed to fueling the flames of discontent. So without further ado, let's jump into the presentation. And make sure to use the chat because I will be looking back and forth to answer your questions kind of as I go on the topics and really start to dig deep. Make sure to let me know what you think of my responses and the slides thus far. Okay. So screen share, we are all good. Boop, boop, boop. And F5, perfect. So just let me know that you all can see the presentation. That would be extremely helpful, just to let me know that you can both see as well as hear me. Oh, hey, Anne from Belfast, thanks for jumping on. I appreciate it. Everybody seems to be seeing the presentation okay and hearing me okay. That is absolutely fabulous. So let's get on to point work and reflexology. So this idea of point work and reflexology. Reflexology, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with it, but those of you who are on this webinar are probably practicing reflexologists. Point work is the application of pressure to various reflex points on the feet, but also on the other extremities as well. We don't just want to pick on the feet. We want to open that up to hands, face, ears as well. So point work is, as opposed to the general relaxation techniques or even the walking technique that reflexology is famous for, point work addresses this idea of us finding these active reflex points, which we'll define later in the presentation as well, and addressing those reflex points as we find them, and the techniques, methodology, and theory behind how we address those individual points in the reflexes. Make sense? Okay, so let's get into a couple basics. And here's where I'm gonna just give a lot of preface. Pressure is one of the most debated topics in the field of reflexology and in bodywork in general. I find that most of my students, when they come for their first reflexology certification weekend, oh, hey Kimmy, hey Melanie, thanks for jumping on. When they come for their first certification weekend, it becomes a question of, am I using too much pressure or too little pressure? Either they've been conditioned one way or the other. Very few practitioners have the perfect pressure that we're going to talk about. And in fact, some of them will argue with me to the point of, you must press deep, otherwise reflexology is not effective, versus if you don't go light, you are harshly stimulating the nerve endings and they are not feeling the session, and they might also kick you in the face. But with that debate aside, and I find that my reflexologists who have a bodywork backgrounds tend to fall more towards the debating side rather than just pure reflexologists who are conditioned to listen to the tissue fall into that trap. Pressure is one of the big things that we're going to be addressing in this webinar. So second off, you asked for it. So for those of you who are a member of our foot reading and reflexology online community, the FROC group on Facebook, this was one of the topics that you all voted really, really highly in terms of webinar content. So I'm guessing, as well as how many people are jumping on this webinar right now, we've got a handsome group. So it is definitely a valuable topic for all of you to discuss. What is point work? And I would much rather, I'm going to get off on some tangents. I'm going to give you some really cool clinical experiences, but also some social experiences. Like in all of the Facebook groups that I'm a part of with reflexology, some of you, gosh, it's like you've never taken a reflexology class in your life. Just the juvenile questions that you're asking in terms of just how to utilize point work, not using palpation, not even giving a second thought to assessment. Like there are some patterns that we need to correct in this webinar for sure. So I'm glad that you all are asking for this content. So I was told personally that the deeper you go on tender reflexes, the better results that you will get during your session, which I found not true. The hard way, actually, I had clients tell me to my face during the session, please stop hurting me. That does not feel good. And that was like my first inkling, like, maybe there are other ways to practice reflexology. I mean, shocker, just seeing who's in the chat right now, like we have such a variety of reflexology practitioners with so many different sub-modalities hidden within the ranks. Like, obviously, there are more ways than one to practice reflexology. There are many more theories behind it. But it was my first experience being trained in a very deep school to think, oh, well, you don't have to necessarily go as deep in order to be effective with reflexology. And especially when a reflex is tender, that doesn't necessarily mean that you press on it more. Yes? So all of that kind of came crashing in the real world post-certification with reflexology. And so I really had to evaluate, and I teach my students to reevaluate, like really question how much pressure you're using and why. What is the intent? Is it your ego, which is valid? Like some of us are addicted to, working out the tissue, and I'm not telling you don't do it. I'm telling you listen and be intelligent about it. Okay? So now let's talk about, there are interesting trends that I've observed with clients that I would like to share with you. And this is, despite all the experience that I've had with teaching other reflexologists and what I've personally experienced, there are certain client factors that I've learned both from the bodywork side and from the reflexology side, and in talking with other reflexologists, kind of global consciousness regarding to the field, that there are certain things that you need to understand as a reflexology practitioner that I've observed to be very, very true about point work and pressure that we need to discuss before delving into some of the deeper theory. So with all of that being said, oh, hi, Holly, thanks for jumping on. Let's get into some deeper stuff. Oh, and I just love our little chats. I forgot about this one because you all are just so chatty in the chat right now. Everybody's having such a good time. I love how many people are on this webinar, and we can always accommodate more. And it's just such a fun little gathering for us to all talk about reflexology with the fam, the reflexology family, or as I call it in the reflexology group, the foot family. Anyway, so here's my first kind of lesson in terms of point work and reflexology. We are working with the nervous system, very important, as the physical bridge between the internal physical and the actual like dense meat physical state of the client. So let's stop right there. So the nervous system is the modality the system of the body that connects both the physical and the internal. The nervous system relays thoughts and feelings. It also relays physical sensations like heat, pressure, proprioception, and time space, all that jazz. But the nervous system is the system that we are targeting as reflexologists. And that's really important to understand as far as, for those of you who are on traditional Chinese medicine side, I'm going to get to you in a second. But as far as communicating to a client how reflexology works, this is such an important fact to relay. As opposed to reflexology being voodoo mumbo jumbo, or some clients categorizing it as magic, or I don't know how it works, it just works. Like, we need to, as reflexologists, start to educate clients about the physiology behind our craft. And that starts first and foremost with the fact that we are targeting and working with the nervous system and the nerve endings in the extremities in general, which I think is really, really important. Now, second part of this includes all energetic derivatives, okay? So for those of you who are traditional Chinese medicine trained and you want to focus more Eastern versions of reflexology, power to you, I'm all about it. Nervous system accompanies that. So if you are working with meridian language, you still can use the nervous system as the physiological bridge between the energetic movement and the physical sensation. But here's where it really kind of comes down to brass tacks. So the reason I want to remind you of this is the fact that it is ground in the process in a way that is easy to communicate and often mysterious as far as client goes. So let me restate that a little bit clearer. I want to remind you of this fact as a way to ground the process in a way that's easy. So when we're talking about reflexology as a modality, we have to respect the fact that there's an art of compliance to reflexology. So if a client comes in and they feel better, but they don't understand the mechanism for which they feel better, and they try to relay that to friends, family, clients, it's part of that misunderstanding that often takes place with reflexology, which labels it as a mysterious kind of voodoo witchcraft, as opposed to a modality that can be scientifically recognized, physically understood, and measured. For any of you who have done a reflexology session on a client with a Fitbit on, like, those stats are ridiculous. It is so fascinating to see somebody's blood pressure change over the course of a minute, because they're just monitoring their vitals at the same time that you're doing the modality. It's absolutely fascinating. So we need to understand that when we communicate about the nervous system as the physical system which reflexology addresses, regardless of if you want to talk about energy systems or even zones, which can be super complicated for clients to understand, we're using a physically rooted system that they can look up online, that they can look up in an anatomy book, that they've probably heard about, as a way to ground the process and make it easy to communicate and demystify the craft, okay? So with this point work, it's really, really important to start from the basis of easy physical concepts to understand before we go into the more complicated nuances like perfect pressure and addressing specific reflex points, because it all comes back down to the nervous system, like the body's communication system, and that's how it goes. Okay, so let's talk about pressure, everybody's favorite topic, because opinions, I won't go there because this has to be a PG presentation, but anyway, there's an anatomy part that everybody has, and opinions are like that because everybody has one. So in terms of perfect pressure, I know some of you are cracking up at that one. So first we have to ask, where does your client fall on the pressure bell curve? Now, some of you may not have understood this concept of a bell curve, so let me kind of break it down for you. So this is like a bell curve. If you ignore the light blue, dark blue, that kind of bell-shaped curve is what's known as a bell curve. And you can see that it starts off kind of low on one end, it raises in the middle, and then it goes down on the other end. So this bell curve is used in a lot of statistics, especially when we talk about social research. And pressure is no different. So when we talk about quote unquote perfect pressure, we need to understand that every client will fall somewhere on this curve, but no two clients will be the same. Okay. So even if they are on that same place in the pressure bell curve, like they all enjoy like a moderate 5 out of 10 in pressure, there are various contraindications on either side with each person. Like one person might enjoy a 5 out of 5, but it may technically be inappropriate because it's sending their tissues into spasm. Or they may physically enjoy a 5 out of 5, but the tissue is asking you to press more, which is kind of bumping up the session to a 6 or 7 out of 10 on the pressure scale based on what the body needs. So when we talk about the perfect pressure bell curve, it's a mix of understanding what the body is asking for and what the client is asking for. But this is just a general kind of trick of the trade that I wanted to share with you all. So on one end of the bell curve, we have lighter pressure. Then if you wanted to like associate a number value for it, that would be 1 out of 10. Hold on, Bev just asked a question. I was taught massage therapists can go deeper as they are working on muscle and tissue. Reflexologists shouldn't go deeper. We are working nervous system and organs and need to be treated with care. I agree with you, Bev. Here's where we get a little bit different in that methodology. So some reflexologists will just stick to this lighter pressure, this 1 out of 10, saying if we start to invade the nervous system, then that's a no-no. And I totally agree with that, Bev. Oh, hey, Tom just jumped on and said, well done, excellent. But here's the other end of the bell curve. And this is something that I've had to really kind of mentally reconcile with. The heavy pressure. Now, the reason why I use heavy pressure is not necessarily because deep is a bad word, but we can go deep with a person without applying heavy pressure. Do you understand where I'm using that kind of word choice a little bit differently? So heavy pressure is what I want to call a 10 out of 10. Yes? So we have 1 out of 10 and then 10 out of 10. So light pressure would be that client where you're barely touching and they're maybe even wincing. And then 10 out of 10, that heavy pressure, like you're literally going through the foot. Like you are pressing so deeply you can see your wiggling thumb on the other end of the foot, which is not healthy, should not be done. But in an extreme case, heavy pressure is kind of a good example of that. So most clients will fall here in the middle. As with most social experiments, a large majority of the population will fall somewhere in the middle. Like extremes are extremes for a reason. So most of your clients will fall in maybe like the 3 to 6-ish out of 10 scale. Not too deep, not too light, somewhere in between. However, that is most clients, and I'd really like you to pay attention to the extremes because this is where some reflexologists get tripped up. And I know that I personally got tripped up for a really long time about when to use light pressure and when to use heavy pressure. Okay, so let's talk about the light extreme of pressure and then the heavy extreme of pressure. So when we create light pressure, we are barely touching versus heavy pressure, we are penetrating the tissues on a very deep level. What happens with light pressure, and the reason why I would use light pressure, is I would look at the body and the body's response. So when I'm using light pressure, I'm noticing that even as I'm towing that like 2 to 3 out of 10, they're having spasm reactions, they're having sensitivity, it's causing physical irritability within the tissues, or it's bringing them out of the sleep state to the point where it's causing them anxiety during the session, which is not okay. Then we have the heavy pressure side. Now, what's interesting about the heavy pressure side is that clients who truly, truly, truly can tolerate heavy pressure, very rarely will it be throughout the entire foot. When I do 10 out of 10 pressure, I'm normally on a very specific point. I'm not using 10 out of 10 on every single place that I press. But there are clients that I've worked on who require a 7 to 8 out of 10 the entire time. And there is a reason for that. So certain clients fall on this curve based on how their nervous system is wired. Certain clients will be hypersensitive and their body will be on edge. This is also very prominent in somebody who has chronic pain overload tendencies or somebody who is very excessive in their nervous system static. the best way to say it is there's just too much happening internally, and the nerves are sensitive because there's just a lot happening in the system. There's a lot of static on the radio waves. And so that sensitivity, like the body just can't take any more stimulus. And so the light pressure is all literally that can be physically tolerated. But then you have clients on the opposite end of the spectrum where you're working on them, and then maybe about 5-10 minutes into the session, they're like, so how much pressure do you normally use during a session? Or do you normally go this light? Or the last time that I had reflexology, it was much deeper than this. And they'll subtly try to tell you to go deeper. But here's the thing, is what they're actually asking for is a heavier pressure, not deeper work, because their nervous system becomes physically uncomfortable at the opposite end of the spectrum. Their nervous system is so what I would call deficient in terms of like an emptiness, that it needs to be filled with stimulus in order to actually calm down. And this is very, very prevalent in Temple Grandin's work. And Temple Grandin, if you don't know who she is a fabulous, fabulous researcher and presenter on the spectrum in terms of special needs, but also the autistic spectrum, the Asperger's spectrum, and what people who are labeled kind of sensory disorder like type would need in order to survive. And she talks about how this heavy excessive pressure actually calms down those types of clients who have that particular type of nervous system, because that bone crushing pressure feels good to them and they can only relax under those circumstances. So we have those two extremes that I see every once in a while, and maybe like the 1 out of 10 and then the 10 out of 10 pressures are about 15% of clients, maybe, if that. But a majority of your clients will fall within the median range. And some will say, you know, you could have gone a little bit lighter or you could have gone a little bit deeper, but it didn't break the bank. I'm talking about you literally cannot press deeper, otherwise they will cry. And then also you cannot press lighter, otherwise they will cry. Their nervous systems are hardwired to receive two very different extremes of pressure. So that's why I wanted to give you this example of the pressure bell curve, because when you're addressing points, we're going to talk about that as well. But when you're addressing clients who are expecting a reflexology session to sway one extreme or the other, you have to be aware that there are going to be exceptions to the rules, because points are also kind of individual subsections. Yes, thanks for that spelling, Tom, on Temple Grandin. Clients who have the tendency or need for heavier light pressure, that's kind of holistic. But then when we drill into the points, it gets even more specific, because then we're actually listening to the body itself. So let's talk about that. Perfect pressure, client bell curve in terms of pressure, creating that ideal for the client. But now once we have that steady pressure, now we need to talk about a deeper layer of this conversation with individual point work. So let's talk about addressing individual reflex points. First and foremost, you have to find the freaking active reflex point. And this is where reflexologists get confused, okay? So trolling the reflexology chat rooms, as I tend to do, I will often come across the post that says, my grandmother has a blood clot and she also had a stroke 2 years ago. So what reflexes should I press in order to help her situation? Absolutely not. Not just for the fact that you should, highly, use caution in terms of blood clotting and post-stroke, but this idea that the active, quote unquote, active reflex points are not found on the map. They are found within the extremity, in the tissues themselves. And this is a major trip up point for reflexologists in general. We think that we are trained, oh, somebody has stomach issues, I press stomach reflex, I good reflexologist, I make them feel better. That is not an active reflex point. That is what we would term an area of emphasis, which is a whole nother presentation in and of itself. So when we talk about finding an active reflex point, I'm talking about It's as simple as feeling for the textural discrepancy. So a textural discrepancy is you're walking along using your perfect pressure based on what the client needs. You're doing your thumb walking technique to get from point A to point B to palpate the reflex. Notice how I say palpate the reflex, because you are not working the reflex. You are palpating, you are feeling, you are engaging, you are manually asking questions of the tissue to get an answer. That is what separates you from a human meat grinder or one of those foot massage machines that you can buy on Amazon, because you are intelligently working with the tissue, not on the tissue. So as a reflexologist, you are feeling for these areas in these reflexes. Oh, that feels different from the surrounding tissue. That feels hot. That feels cold. That feels empty. That feels full. That feels crunchy. That feels slimy. Or my personal favorite, I'll sometimes describe it as a magnetic sensation. So I'm walking through the reflex, kind of like la la la, walking through the reflex, just, skipping through the daisies. And then all of a sudden my thumb literally will not move. And it's as if the electrical nervous system of my client has gripped my thumb and stopped it from moving and told my nervous system, no, I need you to press here. So that's my personal favorite. And that's when I really know that I've got something good, is when on almost an energetic level, the body kind of sucks in my pressure as if to say, you found it. Yeah. So that's what I mean by an active reflex point. It's an area I've had clients describe it as feeling sparks in the tissue, or you just know that you have to press it, like an intuitive feeling, but you are searching for those points within the reflex that call for your attention. And that is so different from thinking that the entire spinal reflex is the active reflex because somebody has back issues. That's bad logic. Okay, because you don't know whether or not that back issue is coming from the hips. You don't know if that's actually a sciatic nerve impingement that's referring up into the spine. Yeah, you don't know if that's actually a lymphatic issue, which is causing an overflow of cerebrospinal fluid that is causing a back issue. Like, you have no idea until you get hands in the reflexes. And only then will you be able to, through palpation, find those active reflex points and address them accordingly. Am I making sense so far? Like, is that pretty sound logic? Like, we're talking about some pretty advanced stuff, but also some really simple stuff. Like, this is what body work is supposed to be. And I'm getting on a little bit of a tangent, so I'm just going to click the next button before I get too deep. Okay, so 3-step process to finding active reflex points. So you find the active reflex point, right? You find the textural discrepancy. What now? What happens next? Okay, so you trip over the active reflex point. You're like, maybe I should hold this point. How you know you have an active reflex point is in the 3-step process. Okay, step 1 is apply pressure. Okay, what I mean by apply pressure is not grind into the point until there is nothing left, or until the client kicks you in the face or screams bloody murder. That is not reflexology, that is torture. Likewise, it is not being so timid that you hover over the reflex so that the body doesn't even feel you present, okay? It's about applying an even amount of pressure, like a 3 to 4 out of 10 in pressure over a point, to then move to step 2, which is listen to the body's reaction. What this means is when you apply pressure to an active reflex point, you are then feeling or listening through your hands. Yeah, really important distinction there in terms of wording, for what the body chooses to do with your pressure. And we'll talk about those kind of reactions next. But step 1, apply pressure, and then we listen to what the body does about it. And based on what the body does about it, gives us an idea of whether or not we're on the right reflex point, which then generates feedback, which we then give to the client, which we then blow their minds, which they then rebook and become a lifer, you know? So that's how reflexology technically should work. We're not treating every press as an active reflex point. Like we're not thumb walking and every place our thumb hits is an active reflex point. That is not reflexology. Reflexology is utilizing the thumb and finger walking technique to palpate for active reflexes and then addressing those active reflexes as we find them, cataloging kind of where we find mentally, kind of just saying, okay, we found a spot in the lower back. Okay, we found a spot in the liver reflex. Okay, we found a spot in the hip. Okay, we didn't find it on the other side, so it's just one-sided. And you're creating a story in your mind as far as the reflexes that you're finding. And then you're giving feedback to the client afterwards, which will then blow their mind in terms of how accurate you were, not because you're a wizard, but because you listened, okay? Then step 3 is you adjust accordingly. And we're going to talk about how you adjust accordingly in the next slide. So this 3-step process, once you find the active reflex point, you're simply engaging the tissue and listening to the body's reaction and then adjusting accordingly. It's very much like starting a conversation with somebody on the street. Hey, I like your hat. And then they say, thanks, I got it at so-and-so. Oh, I know where that is. Do you live around here? You know, you're having a conversation with the body versus, hey, I like your hat. And they just turn around and walk away. Like that would be the equivalent of the body ignoring you, which happens. And I will talk about that next. So 3-step process, apply, listen, adjust. Okay, now let's talk about the 3 reactions that are possible. So we have this 3-step process, and when you apply pressure and you are listening for the reaction, there are 3 reactions that may happen that will tell you whether or not you're on a point that actually needs to be addressed as an active reflex point. And it will tell you what to do to deactivate that active reflex point or to kind of spot treat the issue. So reaction number 1 is nothing happens. And that's the equivalent of like, hey, nice hat. And they just look at you weird, turn around and walk away. That's the body's way of saying, yeah, no, you might have thought that this was an active reflex point, but I'm telling you that there's nothing here. So when you actually press into the tissue, maybe you wait 30 seconds, 45 seconds. I'd stop it at 45 seconds. I wouldn't go to a full minute, like especially if nothing is happening, because then the clients are like, well, why are you stopping? You know, and they start to question you in terms of your motives. But you're like, shh, I'm listening. So first and foremost, nothing happens. And that's a totally valid reaction, okay? And that nothing happens means that you simply just move on. Like you might have thought that there was an active reflex point there, but the tissue is telling you otherwise. And so you simply move on. And that is your adjustment. So you apply the pressure, you listen for the reaction, which happens to be nothing. So your adjustment is, okay, I'm just going to move on and continue walking. Reaction number 2 is even more fascinating. The body guards against you. So what does this mean? So this is the equivalent of saying, hey, nice hat. And the person goes, rah, 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 rah. I hate you, stop talking to me, and just gets really, really aggressive and tries to scare you away like a primitive animal. So that is very much a reaction that I see in the body when I stop over a reflex point that I think maybe needs attention, and the body's like, nothing to see here, please move around, like caution tape, and they're waving me away from the point, okay? And that's basically the body saying, hey, I've got this under control. There's construction here. Please don't step here. We don't need you. Please move on, okay? Like nothing to see here. So the body guarding against you is a valid response. And that basically means do not touch. Do not touch. Or if you truly feel intently that you should be there, lighten your pressure until you feel the body no longer guarding against you, okay? Then we have reaction number 3, which is the reaction that we all want and expect, but sometimes does not happen. And that is this idea of the body opens to receive you, okay? Now there are a couple nuances to this kind of step or reaction. So the body may simply just welcome your pressure And then what happens is the body, after a certain period of time, will produce a referral sensation indicating that the point has been received, and we'll talk about that later. Or the body will fill in the point underneath your pressure, which is so fascinating to watch, and it'll basically kind of spit you back out saying, thank you, that's enough, I'm done. But the body opens to receive you, and it may take an interesting turn. So the body might not just open to receive you, but the tissues may strategically guide you into a deeper version of the point. Okay, so what this basically means is when the body turns around and, oh, I'm getting some spinning arrows for some reason with the time delay. So when the body starts to open up and receive you, and it will guide you to a specific area, what that means is that the body is literally taking your pressure and saying, no, do it this way. And sometimes it'll turn you on your side. Sometimes it'll ask you to go deeper, but at a specific angle. Sometimes it will ask you to go sharper in terms of using more of the bone of your thumb to get into a crack or crevice. Sometimes it'll ask you to go flatter or broader. Sometimes it'll ask you to kind of back out a little bit and then reapproach. Sometimes it'll ask for an alternating pressure, like a pumping on the point. It is so, so different. But notice what the body is asking for when it truly receives you, because that's something that I've found very, very individual in terms of the points that I'm addressing. So the client will be totally unaware, like totally zonked out on the table, and I'm having multiple conversations with the tissue at this point to basically, like, the point where the ego of the client and the mindset of the client is totally irrelevant, because it's all about me talking with the point that I'm in the middle of. And sometimes, back to that idea of pressure, I'm backing out to a 2 out of 10 in pressure, and other times I'm going so deep, but the client doesn't feel it because it's appropriate. So I'm using that 10 out of 10 in pressure, and I'm about to come out the other end of their foot, but it's appropriate because the body asked me to go there, and the body literally opened up the tissue pathways in order to receive that level of pressure, which is very different from you trying to invade a reflex point because it's quote unquote where you're supposed to press for this issue. Okay, so that's my little pet peeve. So let's talk about the next part of the presentation, which is signs that you did it right. So you found the active reflex point, huzzah. Then you use your 3-step apply, listen, adjust, and you've realized either nothing happened, the body guarded against you, or the body opened to receive you, and there is actually a point there. So here's how you know that the body received the work and you did it right. First and foremost, facial itching. Now, some of you who have taken classes with me or have listened to some of my technique videos, you have noticed this trend. Facial itching is one of the top 4 signs that I will show you in this webinar that the body has received the work. So basically what happens is you press the nerve ending, that pressure shoots up to the brain via the nervous system. The nervous system impulse crashes into the brain, and the brain receives the impulse, and then the brain computes the impulse and generates a counter signal in the form of a feedback loop to adjust the tissue pressure. This creates an internal static, or a kind of nervous system electrical storm cloud, as it were, and this manifests as a facial itch. And the cool part about facial itching when a reflexology session is taking place is that clients won't know that they're doing it. But then also, it does not matter how much they itch, which is interesting because the itch isn't coming from the outside in, like they didn't get bitten by a mosquito. It's coming from the inside out. It's coming from the electrical impulse, which is fascinating. Oh my gosh. So, but here's the thing about facial itching is that facial itching is a really interesting sign to look for, but It can also manifest as itching anywhere on the body. In fact, when the body starts to itch after a reflexology kind of point is addressed, where they itch is also very significant. And Bev just asked, Sam, does this apply to itching in other areas of the body as well? Bam. Okay, just answered that because I'm psychic. So in terms of itching in other places, so here's a really good example. For those of you that are familiar with my face reflexology work, this is fascinating. So I'll work with a specific reflex point and I'll be addressing that point. And then the client will itch their face in the exact facial reflex that matches the area that I just treated. Okay, so that will happen. But then also I'll be in a reflex area that's totally unrelated. And then they'll like itch their arm, or they'll itch their leg, or they'll itch their stomach. And I take note of where they're itching because I often find that the two areas are either throwing tension patterns or compensation patterns back and forth, or I'm already noticing the trend of that vertical and horizontal zone interaction. And that just cues in my mind, hey, this is validating the experience. Tom just jumped on and said, I had a prenatal client who kept feeling it on the top of her bump only. I wonder who that was, Tom. But yes, definitely. So the body takes the impulse where it needs to go, not necessarily where you are telling it. And that's another thing. Like these reflexologists that are so upset because they're pressing the lung reflex and nothing is happening in the lungs, get over it. The body is 10 times more intelligent than that. So when you're looking for a reaction, you're not necessarily looking for a 1-1 reaction. Like if you're walking through the digestive reflexes and somebody says, ooh, I feel that in my digestive system. Like, yes, that does happen. But don't get offended if they say, wow, I really feel that in my shoulder. That to you should be even more of a cue as a reflexologist to say, interesting. I wonder if there's a connection there. Okay. So where they itch is very significant, but it is a sign to look for to say, hey, the body received that impulse and it is adjusting accordingly on the nervous system level. Then we have muscular twitching. So muscle twitching is a really common occurrence. Actually not, Kayla. Are you serious? Oh, that's fascinating. Oh my goodness, so cool. So muscle twitching is a fascinating response because in addition to like facial itching indicating like where the body is taking the impulse on a nervous system level, muscle twitching does the same thing. So as you are releasing various pockets of tension, the body will then contract rapidly in a specific area to show you, hey, I'm releasing tension in that area. Thank you so much. To validate, you just deactivated that point. You just assisted the body in breaking through some kind of wall that it needed your assistance to kind of help break through, and that it's on the case and it's balancing stuff out. So muscle twitching is a really big one that I see as a validating kind of response to say, hey, you did a good job. So also note where they twitch. So if a client reports twitching internally, like, hey, this is making my diaphragm twitch, or hey, I can feel that in my psoas, or you're making my eye twitch, which is really weird, notice that. But then also notice if they're like dead asleep and their leg starts to twitch, or a finger starts to twitch. Like notice where the body is directing your attention, which is where you kind of need to learn how to multitask, not just focus on the routine, but watch how the body is receiving the work, which is a really important kind of advanced level of reflexology. Get your head out of the routine and observing the whole client. Okay. After muscle twitching, we also have stomach gurgling. So stomach gurgling is a fabulous sign that obviously the digestive system is moving. So when we have stomach gurgling, that obviously means that the body is taking it to the digestive space, but notice the frequency of the gurgling. So when a client comes in to see you, do they report digestive issues? If they do or if they don't, and they have stomach gurgling on the table, ask yourself why. Why did the body take the session into the stomach? When I say stomach, I mean stomach, liver, small intestine, large intestine, all of it. So when we see stomach gurgling, the body is saying, I need to move something along the alimentary canal. I need to move something in the bowel. And that is where I am taking the session. So I've had clients come in and they are literally not only gurgling, but they're passing gas throughout the entire session, like literally the entire session. And I'm not emphasizing the digestive reflexes any more than I normally do, but that is just where the body is taking the work. Okay. Likewise, I have clients that say, you know, I am so digestive issue prone, you have no idea. And during the session, the digestive tract is totally silent, which is fascinating. Cindy says, I have a client that is asleep and foot twitches throughout, both twitch. Yep, definitely. Great marker and validating. Notice when you're working specific reflexes, when the feet choose to twitch, because it is not random at all. Okay, so back to stomach gurgling. Notice when the stomach gurgles. If the stomach gurgles throughout the entire session, that's the body's way of saying, hey, we need to address something in this system. I had a client recently who, this is my favorite excuse in the world. I say, you know, hey, your stomach was going kind of crazy during the session. And I ask, you know, how's diet going? And they're like, oh, I eat really clean. Like that is their response. I eat really clean. And I said, well, the body is choosing to disagree with you. So we're not relying on what the client is telling us. We're relying on how the body is responding. And that is 10 times more important than what a client puts on their health history form, is where the body takes the work. Okay. So that's enough for stomach gurgling. Now let's talk about breathing changes. So breathing changes are fascinating, and this can range from a puff of air, like all of a sudden the client just goes, I don't know if you can hear that in the microphone, but just like a spontaneous release of air pocket, which the best way I can describe it is just the body releasing stagnant or stale air at the base of the lungs. But then also spontaneous inhales, spontaneous exhales. I personally consider snoring to be a breathing change. So if a client is sleeping, whether or not they're snoring, but also when their snoring gets really, really deep and really, really loud, that is very significant, very significant. So understanding that breathing changes, the client will often take the work there as well. And that's a sign that the point is releasing something very much in the chest space and very much in the respiratory tract. So I'll have clients that literally throughout the entire session, all they do is make breathing noises. And they're totally passed out. They don't realize that they're doing it, but the body is taking the work so deep into the lungs, it's crazy. But this also, like if somebody comes in and they're having breathing reactions during the session, they also have a history of shoulder pain, upper back tension, maybe some breast issues. All of that is just affirming kind of what we already knew. So just notice breathing changes. Those are my top 4 in terms of reactions with point work, to understand not only the body has received the work that you just did, but also where the body is taking the work. So here are a couple other examples in terms of signs that you did it right and that the body has received your work. Other reactions include eye watering, which is a very emotional marker. When we think of it from a purely physical standpoint, it's very much the body is releasing stagnant interstitial tissue, or fluid rather, interstitial fluid. That would be weird if it was tissue. Interstitial fluid through the eyes. So I often find people who experience eye watering during a session as having built up sinus pressure. But then also eye watering, obviously the body is tearing. Whether or not an emotional reaction is with it or not is irrelevant, but it's just the body literally just releasing some tears, which can be a very powerful experience. Then we have temperature changes. This has nothing to do with menopause. I get clients who ask me all the time, like, Sam, I always get hot during our sessions. Is it because I'm on the menopause or in the menopause? And I say, no, it's just how your body chooses to take the work. Amy just jumped on and said, I have a client that says She gets pins and needles in her feet after a session or close to the end. What is that? That is the body working. In my personal experience, I'd also check for fluid, because if it's towards the end of the session or afterwards, she could have fluid rushing back into the feet, which are strangling the nerves. So she does have like fluid buildup in the feet. That could be why that is. But also, I mean, any kind of tingling, pins and needles, is basically things are waking up. So I'd view it as a good thing, unless it's more on the painful scale. So in addition to temperature changes on the hot side, but also the cold side, very interesting when the body starts to chill. For those of you that have studied with me, it's the water coming to the surface. It's those deep emotions coming to the surface. It's very much the emotional stress and anxiety coming to the surface to be worked through. Fascinating stuff. The temperature changes are, in fact, one of the signs that the body will show you, hey, I'm moving stuff. Energetic sensations. This gets a little woo-woo, so it's important to really coach your client through this process in terms of, like, don't be weirded out. It's totally normal. I press a point and you feel it somewhere else, or it feels like I'm massaging a specific area of the body and I'm not physically present. Or the itching, falls into this category as well. Like you can't stop itching, or you feel these shooting sensations, which could be bad. Like clarify whether it's a shooting or whether it's kind of like a lighting up. Very, very different. So energetic sensations are a really big reaction that I see and can be very, very powerful. Then we have pain increasing or decreasing. A lot of reflexologists focus on the decreasing part of this. Like the goal is to get rid of pain, isn't it, Sam? Like not always, which is not the answer that a lot of people want to hear. So Holly says, as if the other foot is moving. I don't know what you mean by that, Holly. Give me 2 more cents on that. Anyway, so pain increasing, decreasing. So not always do we need the pain to decrease. Sometimes when the pain actually increases, that is a good sign because it means the body is bringing the sensation up and out. Really great example. I had a client who came in with really severe elbow pain. And during the session, the pain actually got worse, but then it traveled from the elbow to the shoulder, and then it traveled from the shoulder to the upper back. And then by the end of the session, it was gone. Even though it was painful during the session, it was making its way through the nerve channel. Holly says, when the other foot moves while working on the other. Yes. So when any part of the body moves, when you're working on the other side, or the client feels it on the other side, that would be an excellent example of an energetic sensation. So pain doesn't necessarily need to decrease during the session for you to know that you're making a difference. Sometimes pain coming to the surface can be a good thing, although it does require more coaching. So just be aware of that. But it does mean that you're pushing stuff. Okay. Having to pee. This is a really, really fun one. Clients sometimes get really embarrassed. It's very much like the farting during a session thing or the stomach gurgling thing. You just have to coach clients to get over it. It's a natural reaction. The body does it all the time. But having to pee is a natural reaction to reflexology. I sometimes get it, like, regardless of how much water I drink. Sometimes during a reflexology session, like all the water chooses to get sucked into my bladder during the session, and I have to pee really, really bad. So everybody's different, but especially if you have clients with heavy water retention, you'll notice that having to pee is a common thread throughout the sessions. Also, on the opposite side of the spectrum, having to poop during a session can be a wonderful thing. So if you need to take a bathroom break halfway through, that is wonderful, and I highly encourage that you do that because it will allow the body to move more stuff once the stuff that has been moved gets flushed out. But having to pee and likewise having to poop, both excellent, excellent signs. And then altered time perception. This is a really, really fun one, especially for clients that have never experienced reflexology before, but have never experienced like meditation or deeper forms of body work where they kind of slip into that altered state. It can be really like a tee hee hee moment where, you know, they come out and they're like, that was trippy. And you're like, yeah, that's totally how it's supposed to be every single time. And they say, whoa. And that's how you know that you really got them to go super deep during the work. So I encourage you to understand that, like, when a client comes in and they're not expecting to go so deep and they, like, the session totally flies by, or they feel like they were in it for 5 hours and it was actually not like really, really short. It was actually really, really long, and it felt like the session was, you know, 5 hours long. Both of those are an excellent sign that the nervous system slipped into that parasympathetic mode where they really got resty and digesty, and they started to lose track of time, as a sign that the nervous system was just kind of fading in and out of waking consciousness, which is delicious. And I highly encourage you to take that as a win when clients experience that. Okay. Client education is a big one. So we're coming to the end of the presentation, and then we'll talk about some questions that you had. Cindy just said, I've had a number of clients with a tee-hee-hee that they felt amazing, but I don't see them on a consistent basis. It's just such a validating marker, Sandy. Absolutely love it. So client education. Is it your responsibility to fix the client by pressing on the buttons that are the reflexes? No, it is not. Let me do that one more time. Is it your responsibility to fix the client by pressing on the buttons that are the reflexes? No. Okay, so clients will sometimes come in, especially if they have no reflexology experience, and they basically say, fix me. Press the button that takes away my such and such, and I'll pay you, is the contract that they think that they're signing. So when it comes to client education, let the client enjoy the session, but make sure to ask and educate them on what actually took place during the session. Okay, so as a reflexologist, you are not a button pusher. That is not your job. And this is like, if you want it to be your job and you wanted to stay at that place, totally go for it. This is probably the wrong webinar for you, and I apologize for wasting your time. But as a reflexologist, I firmly believe that you are not just a button pusher. You are a coach. You are a health and wellness consultant. You are a client advocate. And you are somebody who actually takes the time to speak with the client about who they are, what they have going on, and developing a wellness plan based on what you find during the session. So let the client enjoy the experience, you know, tailor the pressure that is ideal to them, make sure that it's not too light, too heavy, you know, address the points, let them pass out, let them ask questions if they feel like they need to ask questions. But at the end of the session, especially, you should take that information that you gathered throughout the session, the points that you deactivated and where you found them, and educate them on what actually took place during the session. Likewise, hey, I noticed that you kept itching the same area of your face. Did you notice that? That corresponds to this reflex area. Isn't that funny that you have trouble in that area? That definitely validated the reason why you came in here in the first place. Okay. Sandy just said, I review my foot map with the client after every session. Clients are amazed. Some clients deflect as they're not listening to their bodies. Exactly. But regardless of their reaction, it's your job as a reflexologist, I firmly believe. And feel free to throw this out if you don't find it valuable. But I'm just telling you, if you want to take your practice to the next level, like, advocate to them. Like, you thought that you were just coming in for a foot rub. And let me tell you a thing or two, because that's when clients really start to look at you differently and start to respect what you have to say and start to say, huh, there may be something to this reflexology voodoo, you know, and that there is a science behind the art. And it's not just a foot massage, but you are actually, intelligently working with the body as a interconnected uh, kind of organism to then direct a client's wellness experience towards greater balance. Yeah. So client education is really important. I've just said, totally agree with you, Sam. Clients look at us as the professionals that we are. That is definitely the goal. Okay. So now let's review real quick before we go to question and answer, since it's 7 o'clock my time. So first and foremost, speak a language that the client can understand. That starts with talking about the nervous system, and talking about the nervous system as the link between the physical and the internal, and understanding that you are not just working the feet, you are working the entire body through the feet via the nerves. Number 2, listen for your client's individual perfect pressure, because if the client is dissatisfied throughout the entire session and they don't come back, that defeats the purpose. So make sure that you're not overstimulating or understimulating, that you're checking to see where their perfect pressure match is, and that you're applying that in addition to the point work, which comes next. So once you find their perfect pressure and you're palpating the reflexes with that perfect pressure, then you find the active reflex points by palpating for textural discrepancy. And that's kind of finding the individual points. And then there are interesting trends that I've observed in clients that I would like to share with you. And one of those is that idea that, when you find active reflex points, and we'll talk about this with Tom's question as well, there are certain things that they will ask you that you will need to be able to communicate with them in terms of, I found this, does this make sense to you? Or they will ask you, why is this sensitive? There are interesting trends with that we need to be able to, once we find those discrepancies, converse with. And then it's step 1, apply pressure. Step 2, listen for a response. Step 3, adjust. Followed by, finally, educating your clients based on the results of the point work you see and convey how their body received the session. So don't just treat it like a foot massage anymore. You are a reflexologist. You are working points that have value and meaning. It is up to you to know what the value and meaning represents and is. But this whole presentation is just to get you into the category of point work as the deeper layer of reflexology as a modality. So that is all I have to say about that. Und that is that. Now, let us escape this presentation and go face to face, and we will chat about stuff. Okay, so that was a really fun presentation. I'm happy with that. Okay, so now let's go through some questions. And I'd like to start with Tom's questions. So Tom asked, first and foremost, how do you answer when a client is super interested in what you're doing, asking what's that as soon as you stop on something, or, breaking the rhythm? So when a client asks me, ooh, what's that? I will relay the reflex area. And normally that satisfies them. Like, they're curious, but they're not interested, would be the best way to say it, unless they are interested, and then you can have a deeper conversation. But most clients are like, ooh, what's that? And you say, oh, that's the digestive reflexes. And they're like, oh, yeah. And then they go back to sleep. Okay, so that's mostly what I get. But if a client is truly interested in the conversation, then we get into multitask mode, and it's about, continuing the work while you're having the conversation with them, which can be a little bit tricky, requires a little bit of, rubbing stomach, patting head at the same time. But I never break rhythm. So I'll never stop the session and talk to the client. I will continue and talk with the client, but the conversation doesn't affect how long I hold a point, because I'm listening to the body. It just so happens that I'm listening to the body and talking to the client at the same time. So let me know if that answered the question. Second question from Tom: at intake, what's some of your verbiage for explaining how much you will focus on a specific issue versus general relaxation? That's my primary conversation with body work. It's deciding how much time to spend on which body parts. When it's just the feet, that conversation seems to be much more confusing. So in terms of the conversation, I have a canned statement that I tell my clients, and it has nothing to do with working specific areas. Okay, so I basically say during the session, I'm going to be pressing various points. Some of those points may be a little bit more tender than you expect. You can hear like the sing-song nature of my voice, like this is my rehearsed script. So some of the points may be a little bit more tender than you expect, but if anything is too tender, the goal is not for you to kick me in the face. So we need to adjust pressure and let me know. However, when I press some of these points, you'll notice referral sensations, or as if I press some of these points, another area of the body will activate. And if you have any questions during the session, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I will give you my full report when we're back out at the front and give you a rundown as far as what I saw. But in terms of like prepping them or coaching them, like I'm going to be working your stomach reflex extra good, like that is not the intention at all. So really just giving a client a basic reflexology overview, but not going into specifics and only addressing the specifics if they're curious during the session or afterwards if they're relevant. Okay, Tom says yes. Excellent, excellent, excellent. So give me your questions. I'll talk about a couple things in the meantime, but definitely if you have questions about point work, if you have questions about how to address the individual reflex points that you see, let me know. Let's chat about it in the chat before we have to sign it off. But just as kind of a final overcap note from me personally, just kind of like a side rant, our job as reflexologists is to take the profession of reflexology from here to here. And I think that the major area that we are not doing that in right now, and I think the key to going forward is assessment and palpation. So transforming reflexologists from manual therapists into bodywork coaches. So with everything that you're doing and with like the book that I just wrote, Foot Reading, a reflexology primer on foot assessment, like it's no longer just about knowing the map, because the map is not the terrain. Let me say that again. The map is not the terrain. So just because the stomach reflex is on the left foot in horizontal zone 3, half between the diaphragm guideline and the waistline guideline, that does not mean that the stomach reflex will be the source of issue for everybody with a quote unquote stomach issue, nor does it mean that the stomach reflex will be the same texture every time. And I think that that's part of the discussion that reflexologists are leaving on the table, is this idea that we are just manual therapists, and that is not the case. So with this idea of assessment and with point work specifically, like know your craft, but know it so well that you start to take the profession to the next level via the art and science of assessment, because there's only one way to go, and that's up. And I think that that's by asking deeper questions of the body itself, by knowing how to handle your clients as people, and by conversing with the body as an intelligent organism, almost as separate from the client, and talking to both and being that bridge between physical body and client, and knowing when and how to separate the two, and knowing also how to coach both into a state of better wellness, both manually with the body, but also with the client in terms of lifestyle adjustments. Okay. Excellent. Got it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Everybody's just so appreciative. So I guess no questions. If you have any questions and you're watching the replay, definitely shoot it in the comments below. Everybody's yes, 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 yes. Excellent. So as far as, wait, one question, texture on the feet when starting a session, is it better that the client have a foot bath prior to treatment or using a hot towel to start? I always use hot towels to start, 100% hot towels. Foot baths are a little bit cumbersome and a little bit hard to like produce, especially if it's not your clinic, but hot towels are readily accessible and easy. So I always use hot towels just to soften the feet, but I won't like buff or callus. Anne says, Down syndrome, 16-year-old girl, feet felt empty, lots of crisscross lines, couldn't feel, read anything. I'm training presently. So Anne, both the feet feeling hollow and the crisscross lines are both air markers of weakness. So when you fall into the tissue as if nothing is there, that's exactly what's happening. Nothing is there. There's no density. There's no earth. There's no sustenance. Likewise, the crisscross is the body kind of breaking or fracturing or splitting, which is also a sign that nutrition is a really big issue. But then physically, like exhaustion. So probably with everything at school, with the learning that she's doing, with her activities, her nervous system is just really taxed. She may be on medication that's draining the physical nutrients from the nervous system as well and leaching those from the body. So just working with the client, not just from a reflex standpoint to stimulate the body, but also coaching on things like diet, nutrition with the parents, just to make sure that they are doing everything that they can to nourish the child that maybe needs a little bit more nourishment based on kind of what you're seeing in the feet. Okay, so that was a good question, but we will officially wrap up since everybody seems to need to go. Again, if you're watching the replay, feel free to use the comment section below and I will answer them as needed. As a final note, if you are interested in more assessment stuff, if you are watching the replay, it may be a little bit too late, but there will be future rounds coming. We have the foot reading online certification course, the FRUC course, where it is online, it is accessible everywhere in the world, and it is a certification program on foot reading and foot assessment. So you will learn through 12 modules over either a year, 12 months, or 12 weeks based on the version that you pick, how to read the feet and assess. There is also, right now it's early bird pricing for $175, but then there's also $225. It goes up to, but with a payment plan option for $75 a month. So lots of resources becoming available. And also if you're late, then we'll redo the boot camp, the 12-week version in August. And then also the foot reading version 12-month will become available obviously next year. Everybody says, thank you, thank you, thank you. Excited as always. Wonderful. So great to have you all on here. I bid you all good night. And if you would like to reach out, if you have questions, I'm super accessible. Just let me know and I will talk to y'all later. Ciao.